Imagine you walk into a bank tomorrow with $200,000 in cash. No business records, no salary history, no investment account, no explanation, just $200,000. The bank doesn't know where it came from, and suddenly, that money becomes a problem. Because spending illegal money isn't actually the hardest part. The hardest part is making illegal money look like it was never illegal in the first place. And that's where money laundering begins. You've probably heard the term hundreds of times, in movies, in the news, in stories about drug cartels, corrupt politicians, organized crime, and financial scandals. But if someone asked you to explain exactly how money laundering works, step by step, most people would struggle. Because the real process isn't usually as dramatic as Hollywood makes it look. There isn't always a suitcase full of cash being exchanged in a dark parking lot. Sometimes it looks like a completely ordinary business, a bank transfer, a property purchase, an investment, a company that appears perfectly legitimate. And that's what makes money laundering so difficult to stop. Because the goal isn't simply to hide the money. The goal is to give the money a new identity. So let me show you what happens to one fictional pile of illegal money. Imagine someone has $1 million that came from criminal activity. The money is real, but the story behind it isn't. They can't simply walk into a bank and say, "Here's my $1 million." Because the first question will be obvious. Where did it come from? And if the answer doesn't make sense, the money becomes suspicious. So the criminal needs something more valuable than a hiding place. They need a story. The first stage of this process is called placement. This is the moment illegal money first enters the legitimate financial system. And ironically, this is often the most dangerous stage for the person laundering it. Because at this point, the money is still closest to its criminal origin. Imagine that $1 million again. It's sitting outside the financial system, unexplained, unaccounted for, and potentially very difficult to spend without attracting attention. So the first challenge is simple. How do you get the money into the system without making everyone wonder where it came from? Historically, cash-heavy businesses have been exploited for this purpose. Restaurants, car washes, laundromats, used car businesses, places where large amounts of cash can legitimately change hands every day. Imagine a used car lot. On the surface, everything looks normal. Cars are being bought, cars are being sold, customers are paying, receipts are being written. But underneath that ordinary activity, some of the money entering the business may have nothing to do with selling cars. The business isn't the source of the illegal money, it's the disguise. And that's the basic idea behind placement. Illegal money is introduced into legitimate economic activity. But there's a problem. Banks and financial institutions are specifically watching for unusual activity, large cash transactions, unexplained deposits, patterns that don't match a customer's normal behavior. So the moment that dirty money enters the system, it may already be leaving a trail. And that's why placement is so critical, because once the money gets into the system, the next challenge begins. The criminal now has to make that trail harder to follow. And this is where things get much more complicated. Imagine you found that original $1 million. You could trace it back to one transaction, one account, one business, one person. That's relatively simple. Now imagine that same money has been moving through a complicated network of financial activity. Different accounts, different transactions, different companies, different assets, across different jurisdictions. Suddenly, the original source becomes much harder to identify. This second stage is called layering. The goal isn't necessarily to make the money disappear, it's to create distance between the money and where it originally came from. Think of it like dropping a single stone into a lake. At first, you can see exactly where it landed, but then the ripples spread. They overlap, they move in different directions, and eventually, figuring out exactly where that first stone entered the water becomes almost impossible. That's what layering does to a financial trail. The money may move through a complicated series of transactions and ownership structures, making the original source harder to connect to the final destination. And this is where the modern financial system becomes both incredibly powerful and potentially vulnerable. Because the same systems that allow legitimate businesses to move money quickly around the world can also create complexity that investigators have to untangle. This can involve businesses that exist mainly on paper, complex ownership structures, cross-border transactions, asset purchases, and financial activity that, when viewed one transaction at a time, may not immediately appear suspicious. And that's the key. A single transaction might look ordinary, but the entire pattern can tell a very different story. Imagine looking at one puzzle piece. Nothing unusual. Now imagine seeing the entire puzzle. Suddenly, the picture becomes clear. That's what investigators are looking for. Not just one strange transaction, but the pattern created by dozens or hundreds of transactions connected together. The more layers that exist between the original crime and the final destination, the harder the investigation becomes, but eventually the goal is reached. The money is far enough away from its original source that it can begin to re-enter the legitimate economy. This final stage is called integration. This is the point where the money appears to have a legitimate explanation. The money might now look like business revenue, investment returns, property proceeds, or some other form of apparently legitimate wealth. The original criminal activity is no longer obvious from looking at the money itself. The money has a story, and that's the entire point. Go back to our fictional used car lot. At the beginning, some of the money entering the business had no legitimate connection to the cars being sold, but after enough financial activity, the money may eventually appear to be part of the business's legitimate profits. The numbers seem to add up, the paperwork appears complete, the transactions appear to have an explanation. And that's what makes this stage so powerful. The money doesn't have to look suspicious anymore. It has to look ordinary. Because once illegal money appears to have a legitimate history, it becomes much easier to spend, invest, or move. And this is where money laundering becomes more than just a story about criminals hiding cash. It becomes a problem for the entire financial system. Because the money can now enter legitimate markets. Real estate is one example that has historically appeared in money laundering cases. Why? Because property transactions can involve enormous sums of money, and unlike a publicly traded stock, a property's value isn't always one universally agreed upon number. Two similar houses can sell for different prices. Negotiations matter, location matters, timing matters. And that flexibility can make real estate attractive for legitimate reasons, but it can also create opportunities for financial abuse. Casinos have also appeared in money laundering investigations for the same reason, the appearance of legitimacy. Money goes in, transactions happen, money goes out, and suddenly the story attached to the money looks very different from where it originally came from. This is why money laundering isn't simply about hiding cash, it's about transforming the explanation attached to that cash. Which brings us to the question that matters most. If banks, governments, and financial institutions know that money laundering exists, why is it still so difficult to stop? The answer is surprisingly simple, because the financial system is built on trust. When you transfer money, the system assumes the transaction has a legitimate purpose unless something suggests otherwise. When you deposit your paycheck, the bank doesn't investigate your entire life. When a business receives payment from a customer, the financial system generally assumes that transaction is legitimate. That trust is necessary. Without it, the global economy couldn't function, but that same trust can be exploited. A criminal doesn't necessarily need to make every transaction look perfect. They just need enough of the overall story to look believable. And that's why modern systems focus heavily on patterns. A single unusual transaction may mean very little, But imagine a business that consistently reports unusually high cash revenue. Then that money begins moving between several connected companies. Then those companies become involved in property transactions. Then the money moves again. Each individual transaction might have an explanation, but together, the pattern starts to tell a different story. And that's the real battle. The financial system isn't just looking for dirty money, it's looking for the story behind that money. Because money itself doesn't have a label. A dollar doesn't come with a sticker saying, "This came from a legitimate business," or "This came from a criminal enterprise." The difference is the history attached to it. And that's why banks and financial institutions spend enormous resources monitoring transactions, verifying identities, and looking for unusual patterns. The paperwork, the questions, the identity checks, the compliance systems, all of it exists because the financial system has learned one uncomfortable lesson. Sometimes the most dangerous money is the money that looks completely normal. Money laundering matters even if you never commit a crime and never knowingly interact with someone who does, because when illegal money enters legitimate markets, it can have consequences far beyond the criminals who created it. It can help criminal organizations grow. It can finance more illegal activity. It can distort markets. And in some cases, it can allow people who obtained their wealth illegally to compete in the legitimate economy as if they earned it fairly. That's why governments and financial institutions around the world continue investing in systems designed to detect suspicious financial activity. But here's the bigger lesson. Money laundering doesn't work because criminals have discovered some magical way to make dirty money disappear. It works because financial systems depend on something incredibly powerful, a believable story. If money has a plausible explanation, if the paperwork appears legitimate, if the transactions look ordinary, then the system is designed to accept that money as legitimate. And that's why the fight against money laundering is ultimately a fight over information. Where did the money come from? Who moved it? Why did it move? Who benefited? And does the entire story actually make sense? Because one transaction rarely tells the whole story, the pattern does. So the next time you hear about a money laundering case in the news, don't just think about the cash. Think about the story that cash had to be given, piece by piece, transaction by transaction, until the money looked like it belonged. Because that's exactly how it was designed to look.